A police officer finds a white orphaned boy clutching two black babies, shielding them as if they're his own. The officer's heart sinks when he asks what's going on, and the boy's answer leaves him speechless. Why would a child risk everything to protect these babies? What secrets are hiding in his story? This powerful tale will remind you of the strength of family and the lengths we'll go for those we love. Before we get into the story, comment below where in the world you are watching from today. Officer Mark Daniels cruised slowly down Cedar Street in his patrol car, enjoying the peaceful rhythm of another spring afternoon in the suburbs. The warmth of sunlight filtered through the trees that lined the street, casting dappled shadows on the well-kept lawns and tidy flower beds. He waved at Mrs. Peterson, who was tending to her prized rose garden. Her wide-brimmed hat bobbed as she returned his greeting with a cheerful smile. A few houses down, Mr. Thompson walked his golden retriever, Max, both familiar faces on Daniel's regular route. "Beautiful day, isn't it?" Daniels called out through his open window as he passed them. "Sure is, officer," Mr. Thompson replied, giving a friendly wave while Max wagged his tail. The scene was picture perfect, exactly what you'd expect from this quiet neighborhood. Daniels had patrolled these streets for years, and he took pride in knowing almost everyone by name. The familiar houses, the manicured lawns, and the sense of community made this part of his beat particularly enjoyable. As he turned the corner where Maple Street met Oak, something caught his eye that seemed out of place. A young boy, probably no more than 12, was quickly ducking into an alley between two buildings. What drew Daniels' attention wasn't just the boy's hurried movements, but the way he struggled with what appeared to be a heavy burden. Daniels slowed his patrol car to a crawl, his trained eye noting details automatically. The boy was white, with tousled brown hair, wearing clothes that seemed a bit too big for his frame. He moved with purpose, but there was something about his body language that suggested he was trying not to be noticed. The officer's instincts, honed by years on the force, told him something wasn't quite right. It wasn't unusual to see kids in the neighborhood, but this boy's behavior, the furtive movements, the apparent struggle with whatever he was carrying, raised a red flag. Daniels pulled his car to a stop and stepped out, moving quietly but purposefully toward the alley. As he drew closer, he could hear what sounded like soft whimpering. His hand instinctively moved to rest near his radio, not out of any sense of threat but from years of ingrained caution. The boy hadn't noticed him yet, too focused on his burden. As Daniels reached the entrance to the alley, he stopped short, his eyes widening at what he saw. The young boy was holding not packages or stolen goods, but two small babies, both African-American infants who couldn't have been more than a few months old. The sight was so unexpected that for a moment, Daniel stood frozen, trying to process what he was seeing. The boy cradled the infants carefully despite his obvious strain, showing a gentleness that seemed beyond his years. One of the babies made a soft cooing sound, while the other squirmed slightly in the makeshift bundle. Officer Daniels drew in a careful breath, knowing he needed to handle this situation with utmost delicacy. Something was clearly very wrong here, but he didn't want to frighten the boy or, more importantly, risk the safety of the infants. He took one step forward, deliberately making enough noise with his shoe to alert the boy to his presence without startling him. Officer Daniels took another careful step into the alley, keeping his movements slow and deliberate. The brick walls on either side created shadows in the afternoon light, but he could clearly see the young boy's face, etched with worry and exhaustion. One of the babies stirred, making a soft whimpering sound that echoed slightly in the narrow space. "Hi there," Officer Daniels said softly, maintaining a non-threatening distance. "I'm Officer Daniels, but you can call me Mark if you'd like." He smiled gently, noting how the boy's arms tightened protectively around the infants. The boy's eyes darted between Officer Daniels and the alley's entrance, clearly calculating his chances of escape. But with two babies in his arms, running wasn't really an option. He shifted his weight from one foot to the other, his oversized sneakers scuffing against the concrete. "I'm not here to hurt you," Officer Daniels continued, his voice warm and reassuring. "I just want to make sure you and those little ones are okay." He gestured toward a wooden crate nearby. "Would you like to sit down? Those babies must be getting heavy." The boy hesitated, then gave a slight nod. He moved carefully to the crate and sat down, adjusting the infants in his arms with practiced ease. One of them reached up with a tiny hand, grabbing at his worn t-shirt. "I'm Stephen," the boy finally said, his voice barely above a whisper. His eyes remained fixed on Officer Daniels, watching every movement. I'm from the orphanage on Willow Street." Officer Daniels nodded encouragingly, keeping his expression open and friendly. He noticed how Stephen's shoulders remained tense, how his feet were positioned ready to spring up if necessary. Years of experience told him this boy had learned to be wary of adults, and for good reason. "You're doing a great job taking care of those babies, Stephen," Officer Daniels said, gesturing to how carefully he was holding them. "But you must be hungry and tired. Would you let me help? I can get you some food, maybe some clean clothes for all of you." Stephen's expression flickered between hope and suspicion. He looked down at the babies, then back at Officer Daniels. You won't send us back?" His voice cracked slightly on the last word. "Right now, I just want to make sure you're all safe and taken care of," Officer Daniels assured him. "No decisions about anything else until we get you some food and rest. How does that sound?" Stephen's shoulders relaxed slightly and he nodded. The tension in the alley eased as a tentative trust began to form between them. One of the babies cooed softly, almost as if adding their approval to the arrangement. Officer Daniels knelt down slowly, maintaining a respectful distance from Stephen and the babies. "I promise you're safe with me," he said, his voice gentle but firm. "My job is to protect people, especially kids like you who need help." Stephen's stomach growled loudly in the quiet alley, and he ducked his head in embarrassment. The baby girl in his left arm began to fuss, and he bounced her gently, showing a tenderness that touched Officer Daniels' heart. "When was the last time you ate?" Officer Daniels asked, already reaching for his radio. "Yesterday morning," Stephen admitted quietly. "But the babies need formula. They're more important." Officer Daniels nodded sympathetically. "We can get food for all of you. These little ones, they're with you from the orphanage too?" Stephen tightened his hold on the infants protectively. "They're my brother and sister," he said firmly, his chin lifting with determination. "Elijah and Mia." Officer Daniels couldn't hide his surprise. He looked at Stephen's pale skin, then at the two dark-skinned infants. His confusion must have shown on his face because Stephen's expression hardened. "They are my brother and sister," he insisted, his voice stronger now. "Maybe not by blood, but I'm all they have. I've taken care of them since they came to the orphanage. I feed them, I change them, I rock them to sleep when they cry." His voice cracked slightly. "Nobody else does." The conviction in Stephen's voice moved Officer Daniels deeply. He watched as Mia reached up to pat Stephen's cheek, and how naturally he turned to kiss her tiny palm. Elijah had dozed off, one small hand clutching Stephen's worn shirt. "I understand," Officer Daniels said softly. "Family isn't always about looking alike." He pulled out his radio. "Let me call this in. We'll get you all some food, clean clothes, and whatever else you need. Then, if you're willing, you can tell me more about what's going on at that orphanage." Stephen's shoulders slumped with relief, exhaustion finally showing through his brave facade. "You'll really help us?" "That's a promise," Officer Daniels said, lifting his radio to his mouth. "Dispatch, this is Officer Daniels. I need assistance at the alley between Maple and Oak. I have 3 minors in need of immediate care. Food, formula, and clean clothes. Send a female officer if available." The radio crackled with confirmation, and Stephen visibly relaxed at the mention of food and formula. His eyes grew heavy, the adrenaline that had kept him going finally starting to wear off. Still, he maintained his careful hold on the babies, his protective instinct evident in every movement. "Help is coming," Officer Daniels assured him. "Would you feel comfortable telling me more about what made you leave the orphanage?" Stephen looked down at the sleeping infants in his arms, then back at Officer Daniels. His hunger and exhaustion seemed to war with his caution for a moment before he finally nodded. "Okay," he said quietly. "I'll tell you everything." As they waited for backup to arrive, Stephen's story began to pour out, his voice barely above a whisper. Officer Daniels leaned in closer, making sure not to miss a single word while keeping a respectful distance to help the boy feel safe. "Mrs. Harrison, she runs the place," Stephen explained, adjusting Mia in his arms as she stirred. She doesn't like kids who look different. When Elijah and Mia came to us 6 months ago, she put them in the worst cribs, in the coldest corner of the nursery." Officer Daniels noticed Stephen's hands trembling as he continued. "She would forget to feed them on purpose, said they weren't worth the formula. I started sneaking into the kitchen at night to make their bottles." His voice cracked with emotion. "I couldn't let them go hungry." Mia whimpered softly, and Stephen automatically started humming to her, a gentle tune that quickly settled her. The tenderness of the moment contrasted sharply with the harsh reality he was describing. The older kids, they saw how Mrs. Harrison treated Elijah and Mia. They started doing mean things too. Stephen's eyes welled up with tears. They'd pull Mia's hair and pinch Elijah when nobody was looking. Mrs. Harrison would just laugh and say they were toughening them up. Officer Daniels felt his jaw tighten, but he kept his expression neutral, not wanting to frighten Stephen. "You did the right thing by telling me," he assured the boy quietly. "Yesterday," Stephen continued, his voice shaking, "I heard Mrs. Harrison on the phone. She was talking about sending them away, somewhere worse. She said nobody would want to adopt them anyway." He looked up at Officer Daniels, his eyes fierce despite his exhaustion. "I couldn't let that happen. They're my family now. So I waited until night, packed what I could carry, and we left." The sound of approaching sirens made Stephen flinch. Officer Daniels quickly raised his hand in a calming gesture. "That's just help arriving," he explained softly. "You're safe now. All 3 of you are safe." Stephen nodded, but his grip on the babies tightened instinctively. "You believe me, right?" he asked, his voice small and uncertain. "About Mrs. Harrison?" Officer Daniels met Stephen's gaze directly, his expression serious but kind. "I believe every word," he assured him. "What happened at that orphanage was wrong, and we're going to make sure it doesn't happen anymore. You were very brave to protect Elijah and Mia the way you did." Tears finally spilled down Stephen's cheeks as the weight of his fear and exhaustion caught up with him, but even as he cried, he continued to hold the babies securely, his protective nature never wavering. Officer Daniels listened intently as Stephen shared more details about the daily cruelties they had endured. With each new revelation, his concern grew deeper, but he maintained a calm demeanor for Stephen's sake. He knew that getting this testimony was crucial, but equally important was making sure these 3 children felt safe and protected now. Stephen recalled the incident that finally pushed him to this extreme step. He described how his heart pounded as he watched Ms. Gravely drag Elijah and Mia, who were crying badly, toward the dark storeroom at the back of the orphanage. He was supposed to be mopping the hallway floors, but the sight of the babies' frightened faces made him freeze mid-stroke. Through the gap in the door, he could see Mrs. Henderson roughly setting them down on the cold concrete floor. "Maybe this will teach you to be quiet," she snapped, her voice harsh in the dim space. The lock clicked shut with a heavy sound that made Stephen's stomach turn. The baby's cries echoed through the walls, muffled but clear enough to tear at his heart. He pressed his hands against the wall, feeling helpless as their wails grew more desperate. Other children passed by, some giggling, others looking away uncomfortably, but no one dared to help. Throughout the day, Stephen watched and waited. He noticed how Ms. Gravely kept the ring of keys clipped to her belt during the day, but always hung them in her office before heading to bed. He carefully observed the night guard's rounds, every 2 hours like clockwork starting at 10 p.m. The back door near the kitchen was never properly locked. Ms. Gravely always complained about the broken latch but never bothered to fix it. Stephen knew this was their best chance. He'd seen the guard's routine enough times to know there was a 15-minute window when that section of the building was completely unmonitored. As he went about his daily chores, Stephen's mind raced with plans. He quietly gathered supplies throughout the day. Some formula he'd hidden away, clean diapers, and 2 bottles he'd managed to wash and keep secret. He stuffed these items under his thin mattress, along with a small blanket he'd been saving for the babies. When night fell, Stephen lay in his bed fully dressed, counting the minutes. His heart thundered so loudly in his chest that he worried it might wake the other boys in his room. The old clock in the hallway struck midnight, and he heard Mrs. Henderson's heavy footsteps heading to her quarters. He waited another 30 minutes, making sure everyone was asleep. Then, moving like a shadow, Stephen slipped out of bed and crept to Ms. Gravely's office. The keys hung on their usual hook, gleaming faintly in the moonlight that filtered through the window. With trembling fingers, he lifted them off the hook, wrapping them in his shirt to keep them from jingling. The walk to the storeroom felt endless. Every creak of the floorboards made him freeze, but the house remained silent except for the usual nighttime sounds. At the storeroom door, Stephen's hands shook so badly he almost dropped the keys. It took 3 tries to find the right one, and each metallic scrape seemed deafening in the quiet hallway. Finally, the lock turned with a soft click. Inside, Elijah and Mia were huddled together in a corner. Their faces lit up when they saw him, and they reached for him with tiny hands. Stephen quickly scooped them up, his heart breaking at how cold they felt. Keeping to the shadows, Stephen made his way to the kitchen's back door, the babies pressed close to his chest. He paused at each corner, listening intently before moving forward. The night guard's footsteps echoed from the far end of the building, right on schedule. With one final look behind him, Stephen pushed open the back door and stepped out into the cool night air. Freedom was just ahead, but he knew they weren't safe yet. Holding the babies tight, he disappeared into the darkness, leaving behind the only home they'd ever known. Officer Daniels felt his chest tighten as he listened to the final details of Stephen's story. The boy's voice had grown hoarse from talking, and his eyes were red-rimmed from holding back tears. The 2 babies, Elijah and Mia, were now sleeping peacefully in Stephen's arms, their tiny hands clutching his worn shirt. "Stephen," Officer Daniels said softly, kneeling down to meet the boy's eyes, "I want to help you. All of you. Would you let me take you to my home? Just for now, until we figure things out?" Stephen's body tensed immediately. He pulled the babies closer to his chest, his eyes darting between Officer Daniels and the alley's exit. "How do I know I can trust you?" he whispered, his voice trembling. Officer Daniels reached slowly into his pocket and pulled out his wallet. Inside was a photo of his house, a modest 2-story home with a small garden out front. "This is where I live," he explained, showing Stephen the picture. "It's warm, safe, and there's plenty of food. My wife Maria is a wonderful cook." Stephen studied the photo carefully, his expression a mixture of longing and fear. Officer Daniels could see the internal struggle playing out on the boy's face, the desperate need for help warring with the instinct to run that had been ingrained by months of abuse. "The babies need proper care," Officer Daniels added gently. "They need warm beds and fresh clothes. I promise you, Stephen, no one will separate you from them." After what seemed like an eternity, Stephen gave a small nod. Officer Daniels let out a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding. The walk to the patrol car was slow and careful. Stephen flinched at every sudden movement, but Officer Daniels maintained a calm, steady presence. He opened the back door and helped Stephen settle in with the babies, making sure they were secure. As they drove through the quiet streets, Officer Daniels kept glancing in the rearview mirror. Stephen sat rigid in his seat, his eyes fixed on the passing scenery. The babies slept on, unaware of the tension in the car. The only sounds were the soft hum of the engine and the occasional crackle of the police radio, which Officer Daniels had turned down to avoid startling the children. Streets rolled by under the afternoon sun, as Officer Daniels steered them toward the suburbs. His thoughts drifted to Maria, wondering how she would react when he brought 3 unexpected guests home. She had always wanted children, but they hadn't been blessed with any of their own yet. His grip tightened slightly on the steering wheel as he imagined her expression when she opened the door. The silence in the car grew heavier with each passing minute. Stephen remained vigilant, his body tense as if ready to bolt at the first sign of danger. Officer Daniels wanted to say something reassuring, but he sensed that right now, silence was what the boy needed most. Officer Daniels drove carefully through the suburban streets, each turn bringing them closer to home. His heart beat faster as he thought about Maria, his fingers drumming nervously against the steering wheel. The memory of their last conversation about adoption was still fresh in his mind, as vivid as if it had happened yesterday. The evening light cast long shadows across the familiar neighborhood, each house they passed bringing him closer to what could be a life-changing moment. Just last week, they had finally submitted their adoption application after years of failed fertility treatments and countless doctor visits. Maria's tears had mixed with her smile as she signed the papers, her hand trembling slightly as she wrote her name, hope finally rekindling in her eyes after so much disappointment. They had held each other for a long moment afterward, both too overwhelmed to speak. The stack of completed forms had sat on their coffee table for days afterward, a physical reminder of their dreams. The patrol car rolled to a stop at a red light, and Daniels glanced in the rearview mirror, his breath catching in his throat. Stephen sat perfectly still, his small frame curved protectively around the sleeping twins, one tiny hand resting on each of their shoulders. The sight made Daniel's throat tight with emotion. Could this be more than coincidence? The timing seemed almost too perfect to be random chance, as if some greater force was at work. Even the way the streetlights illuminated the children's peaceful faces seemed meaningful somehow. He remembered the night Maria had broken down in their kitchen, surrounded by yet another round of negative pregnancy tests scattered across their kitchen counter. Maybe, she had whispered through her tears, her voice barely audible as she clutched his hand. Our baby is already out there somewhere, just waiting for us to find them. Those words echoed in his mind now as he looked at the 3 children in his back seat, their presence feeling more and more like an answer to years of prayers. The weight of possibility pressed against his chest, making it hard to breathe as he imagined what Maria would say when he pulled into their driveway. Stephen's body tensed suddenly as they turned onto Willow Street. His eyes grew wide with recognition, and panic seized his small frame. No, please, you can't take us back there," he cried out, clutching the sleeping babies closer to his chest. Officer Daniels immediately slowed the patrol car, his heart aching at the fear in Stephen's voice. Hey, it's okay," he said softly, pulling over to the curb. "We're not going back there, Stephen. I promise you that. We just need to pass this way to get to my house." Tears streamed down Stephen's face as he pressed himself further into the back seat. "They'll hurt Elijah and Mia again," he whispered, his voice trembling. "Please don't make us go back." "Look at me, Stephen," Officer Daniels said, turning in his seat to meet the boy's frightened eyes. "I gave you my word that I would keep you safe, and I meant it. We're going to my home where my wife is waiting. No one is going to hurt any of you ever again." As he spoke these reassuring words, Daniels's trained eye took in the weathered brick building across the street. The sign read, "Grace Haven Children's Home," but there was nothing graceful about the imposing structure with its barred windows and unkempt grounds. He committed the address to memory, making a mental note to launch an investigation first thing tomorrow morning. Stephen's breathing slowly steadied as he realized they weren't pulling into the orphanage's driveway. Little Mia stirred in his arms, making soft cooing sounds, while Elijah remained peacefully asleep. The terror in Stephen's eyes gradually faded, replaced by cautious relief. "See?" Officer Daniels said gently, pointing ahead. "My house is just a few blocks further. We'll be there in less than 5 minutes." He started the car again, deliberately driving past the orphanage at a steady pace. In his rearview mirror, he watched as Stephen's grip on the babies loosened slightly, though the boy's gaze remained fixed on the building until it disappeared from view. As they continued their journey, the tension in the car slowly dissipated. Stephen's shoulders relaxed incrementally with each block they put between themselves and the orphanage. Officer Daniels kept his voice calm and steady as he pointed out familiar landmarks along the way. The park where neighborhood children played, the ice cream shop on the corner, the library with its colorful children's section visible through large windows. Finally, they turned onto Cedar Street and Officer Daniels' house came into view. "Here we are," he announced, pulling into the driveway. He watched as Stephen took in the sight of the welcoming 2-story home with its neat garden and warm yellow porch light. "Ready to go inside?" Daniels asked softly, opening his car door. Stephen nodded hesitantly, carefully adjusting his hold on the twins as Officer Daniels helped them out of the patrol car. Together, they walked up the flower-lined path toward the front door, leaving the shadow of the orphanage far behind. Officer Daniels fumbled with his keys at the front door, his heart racing as he heard Maria's footsteps approaching from inside. His usually steady hands trembled slightly as he tried to fit the key into the lock. The door swung open, and there stood his wife, her dark hair pulled back in a neat ponytail, wearing her favorite blue apron dusted with flour from her morning baking. "Mark, did you forget something?" Maria's warm brown eyes crinkled with confusion. It wasn't like her husband to return home in the middle of his shift, and the worried look on his face made her stomach tighten with concern. "Maria, honey," Officer Daniels began, then stepped aside slightly, revealing Stephen standing behind him, clutching Elijah and Mia protectively to his chest. The boy's knuckles were white from holding the babies so tightly, his small frame rigid with uncertainty. Maria's hand flew to her mouth, her eyes widening as she took in the sight of the 3 children. "Oh my goodness," she whispered, her gaze moving from Stephen's frightened face to the sleeping infants in his arms. Her maternal instincts immediately kicked in at the sight of their disheveled appearance. "Please, let's all go inside," Officer Daniels said gently, placing a reassuring hand on Stephen's shoulder. "We need to talk." The morning sunlight streamed through the windows, casting long shadows across the entryway. They made their way to the living room, where Stephen perched nervously on the edge of the couch, still holding the babies close. His feet barely touched the ground, and he kept glancing toward the door as if planning an escape route. Maria sat in her favorite armchair, her eyes never leaving the children, while Officer Daniels remained standing, gathering his thoughts and running a hand through his graying hair. "I found them during my patrol," he began, his voice soft but steady. "Stephen here had escaped from Grace Haven Children's Home with his younger siblings." He went on to explain the circumstances of their meeting in the alley, watching as Maria's expression shifted from surprise to deep concern, her fingers twisting the edge of her apron. As Officer Daniels described the cruel treatment at the orphanage, the locked storeroom, the racial discrimination, the neglect, Maria's eyes filled with tears. She listened intently as her husband detailed Stephen's brave escape and his determination to protect Elijah and Mia, her heart breaking with each new revelation. "They need a safe place, Maria," Officer Daniels concluded, his voice thick with emotion. "They need help." His eyes met his wife's, conveying without words the urgency of the situation. The room fell silent except for Mia's soft cooing. Stephen sat perfectly still, his eyes darting between Officer Daniels and Maria, while Maria's gaze moved from her husband to the 3 children on her couch. The air was heavy with anticipation as they waited for her response. The ticking of the grandfather clock in the corner seemed impossibly loud in the quiet room. Maria's eyes lingered on Stephen's tense posture, noting how his small hands protectively cradled the twins despite their obvious weight. She observed the baby's wrinkled clothes and Elijah's slight whimper of discomfort. The look of fear and hope mingled in Stephen's eyes made her heart ache. A gentle breeze rustled the curtains, carrying with it the sweet scent of the flowering jasmine from their garden, as if nature itself was holding its breath, waiting for what would happen next. Maria rose slowly from her chair, her eyes glistening with tears of joy and compassion. She moved toward Stephen with gentle, deliberate steps, careful not to startle him, just as she would approach a frightened deer in the woods. Her soft cardigan rustled as she knelt before the young boy, her arms opening wide in a welcoming gesture that spoke of safety and unconditional love. "You brave, wonderful boy," she whispered, her voice trembling with emotion as she wrapped her arms around Stephen and the babies. "What you did to protect your brother and sister, that's the most courageous thing I've ever heard. You're an amazing big brother." Stephen's rigid posture began to soften under her embrace, like ice melting in the spring sun. His lower lip trembled as tears welled up in his eyes, years of pent-up fear and loneliness finally finding release in Maria's maternal warmth. His small hands clutched at her sweater, holding on as if afraid she might disappear. Officer Daniels stepped forward, the floorboards creaking softly beneath his feet as he placed one hand on his wife's shoulder and the other on Stephen's back. "Son, you don't have to be scared anymore," he said, his voice thick with emotion, his police badge catching the afternoon light. "If you'd like, We'd love for all three of you to stay here, to be part of our family." Maria pulled back slightly, cupping Stephen's face with her gentle hands. "We've been hoping to adopt children," she explained softly, wiping away his tears with her thumb, her wedding ring cool against his cheek. "And now here you are, a wonderful big brother who needs a home. Would you like that? Would you like us to be your mom and dad?" Stephen's tears fell faster now, but a small smile appeared on his face as he nodded, hope blooming in his eyes for the first time in years. Maria and Officer Daniels enveloped all three children in a group hug, their own tears flowing freely as the babies cooed contentedly between them. "Oh," Maria suddenly exclaimed, jumping to her feet with newfound energy, her maternal instincts kicking into high gear. "These babies need fresh diapers, and you all need baths and clean clothes. And food. You must be starving." She bustled around the living room, making mental lists, her hands gesturing animatedly. "Mark, please bring down those new towels from the linen closet, the soft blue ones. I'll warm up some soup, and then we can give these little ones a proper bath." Officer Daniels nodded, already heading for the stairs with purposeful strides, while Maria rushed to the kitchen, her feet practically dancing across the floor as she called back over her shoulder. "Stephen, sweetheart, you just sit tight with the babies. We're going to take good care of all of you." The transformation in the house was immediate and magical. Drawers opening and closing, water running, the microwave humming, all the sounds of a home springing into action to welcome its newest family members. The afternoon sunlight streamed through the windows, warming the scene with golden promise, as if nature itself was blessing this new beginning. Maria gently tucked the freshly bathed and fed children into the guest bedroom. Stephen lay on his side, one arm protectively draped over his siblings who nestled close to him on the large bed. The afternoon sun filtered through the curtains, casting a warm, peaceful glow across their sleeping forms. "Rest well, my darlings," Maria whispered, carefully pulling up the soft blanket. She watched as their breathing settled into a steady rhythm, their faces finally relaxed in peaceful slumber. In the living room, Officer Daniels sat in his favorite armchair, his police notepad open on his lap. His jaw clenched as he reviewed the details Stephen had shared about the orphanage. The image of innocent babies locked in a dark storeroom made his stomach turn. "They're finally asleep," Maria said softly, entering the room. She perched on the arm of his chair, placing a comforting hand on his shoulder. "What are you thinking, Mark?" "About everything those kids went through," he replied, his voice tight with controlled anger. "No child should ever experience that kind of cruelty. And how many others might still be there, Maria? How many other children are being mistreated right now?" He stood up and began pacing the room, his police training kicking in as he organized his thoughts. "We need to make this right. First, we'll need to file for emergency temporary custody of the children. I'll contact Child Protective Services and get an investigation started immediately." Maria nodded, her eyes following his movement across the room. "And the orphanage?" "I'm going there today," Daniel said firmly, checking his watch. "That caretaker needs to be held accountable. This isn't just about Stephen, Elijah, and Mia anymore. It's about every child in that facility." He gathered his police badge and car keys, his mind already mapping out the steps he would need to take. The adoption process would be complicated, especially given the circumstances, but he was determined to navigate whatever challenges lay ahead. "Be careful," Maria called after him as he headed for the door. "Those children need you to come home safely." Daniels paused at the doorway, turning back to his wife. "Keep them close. I'll be back as soon as I can." With one last glance toward the bedroom where the children slept, Officer Daniels stepped out into the afternoon sun, his resolve strengthening with each step toward his patrol car. Officer Daniels pulled up to Heartwood Orphanage, a weathered Victorian building with peeling paint and overgrown hedges. The front steps creaked under his feet as he approached the heavy wooden door and pressed the tarnished brass doorbell. After a moment, the door swung open to reveal Ms. Helen Gravely, a plump woman with steel gray hair pulled back in a severe bun. Her thin lips curved into what might have been meant as a smile, but it didn't reach her cold eyes. "Good afternoon, officer. What brings the police to our humble establishment?" Her voice was sugary sweet, but there was an edge to it that made Daniel's skin crawl. "Routine business, ma'am," Daniels replied professionally, maintaining a neutral expression. "I'm conducting audits of local childcare facilities. May I come in?" Ms. Gravely's smile tightened slightly, but she stepped aside. "Of course, officer. Right this way to my office." She led him down a dim hallway, their footsteps echoing on the worn wooden floors. The walls were bare except for a few faded photographs of stern-looking people Daniels assumed were previous caretakers. The air smelled of old wood and something else. Bleach, perhaps, but too strong. Ms. Gravely's office was small and cluttered, with filing cabinets lining one wall and a heavy desk dominating the space. She settled into her chair and gestured for Daniels to take the seat across from her. "We maintain the highest standards here at Heartwood," she said, folding her hands on the desk. "What exactly would you like to see?" Daniels pulled out his notepad, appearing to consult a checklist. "I'll need to review your registration documents, health and safety certificates, and records of all current and recently departed children. Standard procedure, you understand?" "Of course," Ms. Gravely replied, though her fingers drummed briefly on the desk. "Though I must say, this is the first time the police department has conducted such an audit." "New initiative," Daniels explained smoothly. "We're working more closely with child services these days. Better coordination means better care for the children." Ms. Gravely's expression remained fixed as she turned to the filing cabinet behind her. "How progressive. Let me gather those documents for you." As she rifled through the files, Daniels observed her office more carefully. A ledger on her desk caught his eye. It appeared to be a financial record, with several columns of numbers hastily scribbled in red ink. "Here we are," Ms. Gravely said, placing a stack of folders on the desk. "Our registration papers are on top, followed by our health inspections and child records. Though I must say, some of these are quite confidential." "That won't be a problem," Daniels assured her, reaching for the folders. "As a law enforcement officer, I'm authorized to review sensitive documents. Would you mind if I used your desk to go through these?" Ms. Gravely hesitated for a fraction of a second before nodding. "By all means. I'll give you some privacy. I need to check on the children anyway." She rose from her chair, that artificial smile still fixed in place. "Just ring the bell on the desk if you need anything." In the dim confines of Ms. Gravely's office, Officer Daniels waited patiently, his trained eye taking in every detail. The heavy curtains filtered the afternoon sunlight, casting long shadows across the worn carpet. A wall clock ticked steadily, marking each passing moment with mechanical precision. The musty scent of old papers and furniture polish hung in the air, mixed with the faint sweetness of artificial air freshener trying to mask it. Ms. Gravely's heels clicked against the wooden floor as she hurried back, her arms laden with manila folders and loose papers. Her usually stern demeanor seemed slightly cracked, like a mask beginning to slip. Tiny beads of sweat had formed on her forehead despite the cool temperature in the room. Her silver pendant swung back and forth against her chest as she moved, catching the filtered light. "Here are all our records, officer," she said, her voice wavering slightly as she set the stack down on the desk. Her hands trembled as she arranged the papers, causing several sheets to scatter across the surface. "Oh dear, how clumsy of me." She gave a nervous laugh that sounded more like a hiccup. Daniels helped gather the fallen papers, noting how Ms. Gravely's fingers shook as she reached for them. "Thank you, ma'am. I'll need to review these thoroughly." His calm demeanor seemed to make her even more agitated, and she kept smoothing her skirt with trembling hands. He began methodically sorting through the documents, maintaining a professional expression even as he located the files for Stephen, Elijah, and Mia. The papers were surprisingly thin, with several obvious gaps in the documentation. Coffee stains marked some corners, while others showed signs of being hastily amended. Looking up from the scattered papers, Daniels cleared his throat. "Ms. Gravely, I'll need to conduct a head count of all children currently in your care. Standard procedure, you understand." His voice was gentle but firm, leaving no room for argument. The color drained from Ms. Gravely's face. She clutched the edge of her desk, her knuckles turning white. A pen holder tipped over as she gripped the wood. A head count? But surely that's not necessary. The numbers are all there in the files. I'm afraid I must insist, Daniels replied firmly, watching as the caretaker's composure continued to crack. It's part of our new verification process. His hand rested casually near his notepad, ready to document any inconsistencies. Ms. Gravely's lip quivered, and she dabbed at her forehead with a handkerchief she pulled from her pocket. Her breathing had become shallow and quick. Well, that is, perhaps we could schedule that for another day? Some of the children are napping, you see? She forced a smile that didn't reach her eyes, which darted nervously toward the office door. In the common hall of Heartwood Orphanage, fluorescent lights buzzed overhead as children filed in, their shuffling feet echoing against the worn linoleum floor. Ms. Gravely stood at the front, her usual commanding presence diminished by nervous fidgeting with the buttons of her cardigan. "Line up, children, single file, please," she called out, her voice carrying a slight tremor. The children, ranging from toddlers to early teens, formed uneven rows before Officer Daniels. Daniels held the roster in his steady hands, a pen poised to check off names. The paper was creased and yellowed at the edges, suggesting its age. "When I call your name, please step forward and say 'present,'" he instructed, his voice gentle but firm. One by one, the children responded to their names. Some spoke clearly, others barely whispered. Daniels noticed how several of them avoided making eye contact, their shoulders hunched as if carrying invisible weights. "Timothy Anderson? Present. Sarah Blake? Present. Michael Chen? Here." As the roll call continued, Daniels made careful notes on his pad. His trained eye caught the slight twitch in Ms. Gravely's face each time he reached a name that went unanswered. The silence following these names hung heavy in the air. When the last child had been counted, Daniels reviewed his notes. 5 names remained unchecked: Stephen, Elijah, and Mia, whom he knew were safe at his home, and 2 other names, both belonging to young black girls. "Ms. Gravely," Daniels said, turning to face the caretaker, "I show 5 children missing from your roster. Can you explain these discrepancies?" Ms. Gravely's face flushed red and she tugged at her collar. "Oh, well, you see," she fumbled with her words, glancing nervously at the children still standing in formation. "Some children have been adopted. Yes, adopted. The paperwork must be misplaced." "All 5 of them?" Daniels asked, his tone measured but skeptical. "Including Stephen, Elijah, and Mia?" At the mention of those names, Ms. Gravely's composure crumbled further. Her hands fluttered like trapped birds. "Those 3, they ran away." "Yes, that's right. Troublemakers, the lot of them. We've been meaning to report it, but—" "And the other 2 girls?" Daniels pressed, watching as beads of sweat formed on Ms. Gravely's upper lip. That is to say, there must be some mistake in the records," she stammered, backing away. In Ms. Gravely's office, the afternoon sun cast long shadows through the Venetian blinds. She shuffled through a filing cabinet, pulling out several manila folders with trembling hands. "You see, Officer Daniels," she began, her voice wavering, "those 2 girls, Sarah Johnson and Maya Williams, they vanished about a year ago. Such troubled children." She placed 2 police reports on her desk, sliding them toward Daniels. The papers looked official at first glance, but Daniels noticed inconsistencies in the formatting. Ms. Gravely continued speaking, her words tumbling out faster. "And then last week, that boy Stephen. He was always a problem child, you understand. He took those babies. Clearly unstable, that one." She produced 3 more reports dated just 2 days ago. "I filed these immediately after their disappearance. The babies were such sweet things, but Stephen—" She shook her head dramatically. "He had violent tendencies. We tried to help him, but some children are simply beyond reach." Daniels carefully examined each report, his jaw clenching slightly at her accusations against Stephen. The documents showed signs of recent creation. The paper was too crisp, the ink too fresh. "The girls," Ms. Gravely continued, wringing her hands. They had similar issues. Behavioral problems, you understand. Always causing trouble. Refusing to follow rules. Her eyes darted nervously around the room as she spoke. We did everything we could to help them, but sometimes children with certain backgrounds, they're just more difficult. The thinly veiled racism in her words made Daniel's blood boil, but he maintained his professional demeanor. He noticed how she kept adjusting her collar, how her explanation jumped erratically between time periods and events. "And you're certain these reports were filed on the dates indicated?" he asked calmly, though his trained eye had already spotted several discrepancies in the documentation. "Oh yes, absolutely," Ms. Gravely nodded vigorously. "I personally went to the police station. You can check with Officer—" She squinted at one of the reports. "Officer Thompson." Daniels knew every officer in the precinct. There was no Officer Thompson. His anger simmered beneath his composed exterior as Ms. Gravely continued to spin her web of lies, each word further incriminating herself. But he kept his voice steady, his expression neutral. The truth would come out, and these children would find justice. Officer Daniels walked through the orphanage's dim corridors, his footsteps echoing against the worn linoleum floors. The afternoon light filtered weakly through dusty windows, casting shadows in corners that seemed to hide too many secrets. In the first bedroom he entered, 3 young girls sat on their beds, nervously watching him approach. He smiled gently, showing his badge. "I'm Officer Daniels. Would you mind telling me what it's like living here?" The oldest girl, about 12, glanced at the door before speaking in a whisper. "Ms. Gravely, she's different with some kids." Her eyes darted to her dark-skinned roommate, who huddled closer to the wall. In the playroom, Daniels found 2 boys stacking blocks. The older one, Tommy, spoke freely once Daniels assured him they were alone. Stephen was nice to everyone. He always helped the babies because Ms. Gravely wouldn't. Tommy's voice trembled. She'd put them in the dark room when they cried. Said they needed to learn discipline early. Each conversation revealed more disturbing details. In the study room, a group of teenagers shared how Ms. Gravely assigned the hardest chores to black children, punishing them severely for minor mistakes. "She made Sarah scrub the entire kitchen floor with a toothbrush because she dropped a spoon," one girl reported, her voice barely audible. The stories about Stephen painted a different picture than Ms. Gravely's accusations. Stephen would sneak milk to the babies when Ms. Gravely wouldn't feed them, a small boy confided. He'd sing to them when they cried. In the dining hall, an older girl described how Ms. Gravely would make the black children eat last, often leaving them with cold leftovers. When Maya complained once, she didn't get dinner for 2 days. The storage room where Stephen had found the babies was exactly as he'd described. A small, dark space with a heavy door and a rusty lock. The mere sight of it made Daniel's stomach turn. A shy 7-year-old tugged at his sleeve near the laundry room. Ms. Gravely said Elijah and Mia were bad babies because they were different, she whispered. But they weren't bad. They just wanted someone to hold them. Each testimony added another piece to the disturbing puzzle, confirming Stephen's account and revealing a pattern of systematic abuse that made Daniel's jaw clench with controlled anger. The children's stories painted a clear picture of Ms. Gravely's cruel treatment, particularly toward the black children in her care. In a quiet corner of the orphanage library, a small group of children gathered around Officer Daniels. Their voices were hushed, but their stories flowed freely now that they trusted him. "Stephen was different," said Jenny, a freckled 10-year-old. "He didn't care if Ms. Gravely got mad. When the babies cried, he'd go to them even if she said no." Tommy, clutching his worn teddy bear, nodded eagerly. "One time, Ms. Gravely locked Mia in the dark room because she wouldn't stop crying. Stephen broke the lock to get her out." His voice dropped even lower. "She caught him and locked all 3 of them in there for 2 whole days." An older girl named Rachel twisted her hands in her lap. Stephen would sneak them extra food from the kitchen. He'd hide bits of bread in his pockets during meals. Her eyes filled with tears. Ms. Gravely would hit his hands with a ruler when she caught him. As Daniels listened, more children shared their memories. They spoke of how Stephen would sing lullabies through the storage room door when the babies were locked inside, how he'd clean their faces and change their clothes when Ms. Gravely refused to touch them. Then Sarah, a quiet 12-year-old, mentioned something that made Daniel's heart skip a beat. "It was like what happened to Maya and Lily," she whispered, glancing nervously at the door. The other children fell silent. Daniels gently encouraged Sarah to continue. "Maya and Lily were like Stephen. They tried to help the younger black kids. Ms. Gravely made them do all the hard work. They had to clean the bathrooms with toothbrushes, scrub the floors at night, and cook all the meals." Sarah's voice trembled. "Then one day they were just gone." "Ms. Gravely said they ran away," added Rachel. "But Maya had promised to teach me braiding the next day. She wouldn't have left without saying goodbye." The children shared how Ms. Gravely had forced Maya and Lily to sleep in the basement, claiming they needed to learn discipline, how she'd withhold food when they defended the younger children, how she'd make them work until their hands were raw and bleeding. "Nobody talks about them anymore," Tommy whispered. "Ms. Gravely gets really angry if we ask questions." Daniels noticed how the children's eyes darted to the doors and windows as they spoke, their bodies tense with fear. Each story revealed more about Ms. Gravely's systematic cruelty and the brave children who dared to stand against it. The pattern was clear. Any child who showed kindness to the black children, especially Stephen, faced harsh punishment. But those who directly challenged Ms. Gravely's treatment of them, like Maya and Lily, seemed to disappear without a trace. As Officer Daniels absorbed these revelations, his trained eye caught sight of small, telling details around the orphanage: scratch marks on the basement door, a recently painted wall in an odd location, missing floorboards that didn't quite match the others. Each observation added weight to the children's stories and deepened his concern about what might have happened to Maya and Lily. Officer Daniels pulled into his driveway, his mind heavy with the weight of everything he'd learned at the orphanage. But as he approached his front door, the sound of children's laughter drifted through the windows, instantly lifting his spirits. Inside, he found a scene that warmed his heart. Maria sat cross-legged on the living room floor, playing peekaboo with Elijah and Mia. The babies squealed with delight each time she revealed her face. Stephen, looking more relaxed than Daniels had ever seen him, was building a tower of blocks nearby, a gentle smile on his face. "Daddy's home," Maria called out, and Daniels felt his chest tighten at the word "Daddy." Stephen looked up shyly, but with clear happiness in his eyes. "Look what we made," Stephen said softly, pointing to a collection of finger paintings drying on the coffee table. Mom, helped us." Daniels knelt down to admire the artwork, noting how the simple act of creating something had helped Stephen begin to feel at home. The babies crawled toward him, their faces bright with recognition. After spending some time playing with the children, Daniels caught Maria's eye and gestured toward the kitchen. She understood immediately, rising to follow him while Stephen remained absorbed in his block tower. In the kitchen, keeping his voice low, Daniels shared what he'd discovered. "The situation at the orphanage is worse than we imagined," he began, describing the children's testimonies and the disturbing pattern of disappearances. 2 girls vanished without a trace, Maya and Lily. They were protective of the younger black children, just like Stephen. Maria's hand flew to her mouth. "Those poor children," she whispered, tears welling in her eyes. "Mark, we have to do something." "I'm going to build a case against Ms. Gravely," Daniel said firmly. "There's enough evidence of negligence and abuse already, but I'm worried about what happened to those missing girls. I need to dig deeper." Maria reached for his hand, squeezing it tightly. "Whatever you need to do, I support you completely. Those children deserve justice, and that woman needs to be stopped." From the living room came the sound of Mia's giggles, followed by Stephen's gentle shushing as he tried to keep his block tower from toppling. Daniels and Maria shared a look of determination, knowing they would do whatever it took to protect not just their new family, but all the children still trapped under Ms. Gravely's care. Officer Daniels sat at his desk early the next morning, his computer screen casting a blue glow across his focused face. He typed Ms. Helen Gravely's name into the police database, beginning what he knew would be a long day of investigation. The first records that came up were basic: Helen Margaret Gravely, née Wilson, age 58. But as Daniels dug deeper, clicking through various files and reports, his brow furrowed with growing concern. 20 years ago, her husband, Robert Gravely, had died suddenly in their home. The official cause was listed as a heart attack, but the investigating officer's notes contained several oddities. There had been signs of a struggle in the bedroom, though Ms. Gravely insisted her husband had simply knocked things over during his cardiac episode. The autopsy report noted unusual bruising patterns, but nothing conclusive enough to warrant further investigation. Daniels leaned back in his chair, rubbing his tired eyes. He pulled up more recent records, searching for any complaints or incidents involving Ms. Gravely. There were 3 separate reports of suspected child neglect at the orphanage over the past 5 years, but each investigation had concluded without finding sufficient evidence of wrongdoing. "How convenient," Daniels muttered, noting how each investigation had been handled by different officers, none of whom had access to the complete picture. He found Ms. Gravely's employment history next. Before inheriting the orphanage from her late husband, she had worked as a nurse at a local hospital. Daniels made note of this detail, wondering if her medical knowledge might have played a role in her husband's death. The more he searched, the more unsettling patterns emerged. While nothing directly linked Ms. Gravely to any crimes, there were too many coincidences, too many near misses with the law. Reports would be filed, investigations would begin, but somehow she always managed to avoid consequences. Daniels pulled out a notepad and began jotting down dates and events, particularly focusing on the period when the 2 girls had disappeared. He couldn't shake the feeling that everything was connected. Her husband's death, the missing girls, the systematic abuse of Black children at the orphanage. Though the evidence was circumstantial, his instincts told him there was much more to uncover about Helen Gravely. His jaw set with determination as he requested access to additional records. He would need to be thorough and careful. Ms. Gravely had proven skilled at avoiding detection, and he couldn't risk tipping her off too soon. The safety of the children still in her care depended on his ability to build a solid case. Officer Daniels stared at his computer screen, his eyes widening as the financial records revealed a disturbing pattern. 2 separate deposits of $25,000 each had been made to Ms. Gravely's personal account within days of the girls' disappearances. The transactions came from an offshore account that was difficult to trace, routed through several banks in countries known for their strict privacy laws. "This can't be a coincidence," he muttered, printing out the bank statements. The timing was too perfect, and the amounts too substantial to ignore. He spread the papers across his desk, circling the suspicious deposits in red ink. His practiced eye caught other questionable transactions, smaller amounts that painted an even darker picture of the orphanage's finances. His hands trembled slightly as he dialed the precinct, his heart pounding with the weight of his discovery. "This is Officer Daniels. I need backup for a confrontation at Heartwood Orphanage. I've uncovered some serious financial irregularities that may be linked to missing persons cases. The evidence suggests trafficking." Within 30 minutes, Officers Thompson and Rodriguez arrived at his office, both wearing grim expressions. Daniels laid out the evidence, explaining the connection between the missing girls and the mysterious deposits. The other officers listened intently, their expressions growing more serious with each detail as they pored over the damning financial trail. "We need to move now," Officer Thompson said, adjusting his utility belt with determined fingers. "Before she has a chance to destroy any evidence. God knows what other secrets that place is hiding." The 3 police cars pulled up to Heartwood Orphanage, just as the afternoon sun cast long shadows across the building's facade, the autumn light making the old structure look even more forbidding. Ms. Gravely was visible through the front window, arranging flowers in a vase, and they watched as her face drained of color at the sight of the officers approaching. She opened the door before they could knock, her fingers nervously twisting the pendant around her neck, a nervous habit that betrayed her composed exterior. "Officers, what brings you here today?" Her voice quivered slightly, her eyes darting between their stern faces. "Ms. Gravely," Daniel said firmly, holding up his badge, the metal catching the late afternoon light. "We need to speak with you about some financial matters we've uncovered." Her eyes darted to the children's rooms upstairs, then back to the officers, panic briefly flashing across her features. "The children? Have you found them?" she blurted out, before quickly covering her mouth with her trembling hand, realizing her mistake too late. Daniels exchanged knowing looks with his fellow officers, a silent confirmation passing between them. They hadn't mentioned anything about missing children, yet Ms. Gravely's immediate assumption and visible anxiety spoke volumes. Her slip had revealed far more than she intended, and the truth was beginning to unravel like a poorly knitted sweater. Inside Ms. Gravely's dimly lit office, Officer Daniels sat across from her, his expression stern and unwavering. The afternoon sun cast long shadows through the Venetian blinds, creating prison bar patterns across her desk. "Let's talk about Sarah and Michelle," Daniels said firmly, placing photographs of two young black girls on her desk. "Your story about their mental disturbances doesn't add up." Ms. Gravely's hands trembled as she reached for her cup of tea. "I've already explained—" "No," Daniels cut her off. "The other children have told us everything. About how you forced these girls to work like servants, about the darkroom punishments, about your special treatment of black children." Her teacup clattered against its saucer. "You can't possibly believe the wild stories of children. What about these?" Daniels spread out bank statements across her desk. $25,000 deposits from an account linked to Marcus Weber. He watched her face pale. "Ring any bells?" Weber was arrested last month for child trafficking. Ms. Gravely's facade began to crack. Her lips quivered as she tried to maintain composure. "And then there's Stephen," Daniels continued, his voice hard with controlled anger. "A brave boy who protected those babies from your cruelty. The children told us how you locked Elijah and Mia in that dark storeroom, how you encouraged others to mistreat them." "Those children," Ms. Gravely spat, her mask of civility suddenly crumbling. "They reminded me of them. The ones who took everything from me." Her voice grew bitter with each word. "My husband. He left me for one of them. Started a new family with her." Her eyes blazed with decades of hatred. "Then he died mysteriously. And they got everything. Everything." Tears streamed down her face as her composure completely shattered. "I couldn't stand looking at those babies every day. Their faces. And those girls, they were getting too old, too defiant. Weber offered good money and I—" She covered her face with her hands, her shoulders shaking with sobs. "You sold them," Daniels finished, his voice thick with disgust. "Because of your hatred, you sold two innocent girls into trafficking." Ms. Gravely slumped in her chair, decades of bitterness and racial hatred pouring out in her confession. "I did it. All of it. The babies, Stephen, those girls. I did it all." In the heavy silence of the office, Ms. Gravely's confession continued to pour out, her voice trembling with a mix of hatred and defeat. "I watched him with her for months," she said, her fingers clutching the edge of her desk. "Coming home late, making excuses, then I saw them together, him, my herald, with that woman. They were planning a life together, a family." Officer Daniels remained silent, his pen moving steadily across his notepad as she spoke. "I couldn't let him leave me for her." Ms. Gravely's voice turned cold. "So one night, I mixed some pills into his evening tea. He never woke up." Her eyes, now distant and hollow, stared through the window. Everyone thought it was his heart. No one questioned it. She laughed bitterly, the sound echoing in the small office. "But then his will revealed everything. He'd changed it, left most of his money to her and their unborn child. I was left with barely enough to survive." Daniels watched as years of festering hatred spilled out. "So when those little ones came to my orphanage," she continued, "all I could see was her face. Their faces reminded me of everything I'd lost. Weber's offer seemed like justice somehow. Taking their children like Harold's new family had taken my future." Her shoulders slumped as the weight of her crimes settled around her. "I sold Sarah and Michelle for $25,000 each," she whispered. "Weber promised they'd go to good homes overseas. I told myself it was better than having them here, reminding me." Daniels stood up, his handcuffs glinting in the afternoon light. "Helen Gravely, you're under arrest for the murder of Harold Gravely, child trafficking, and child abuse." His voice was steady as he began reading her rights. Ms. Gravely didn't resist as he placed the handcuffs around her wrists. The decades of hatred that had sustained her seemed to drain away, leaving behind an empty shell of a woman who had allowed vengeance to poison her soul. As Daniels led her out, she cast one last look at the orphanage that had been both her domain and the site of her crimes. "I never meant for it to go this far," she murmured. "But I couldn't stop hating them. I just couldn't stop." In the warm glow of their living room, Officer Daniels and Maria sat with Stephen on their comfortable brown couch. The babies, Elijah and Mia, were peacefully napping in their newly purchased cribs upstairs. Maria held Stephen's small hand in hers, her touch gentle and reassuring. "Stephen," Daniels began, his voice soft and caring, "Maria and I want to talk to you about something important." He leaned forward slightly, making sure to maintain eye contact with the boy. "We've grown to love you and the babies so much in these past few days." Maria squeezed Stephen's hand. "We want you to be part of our family, officially, all three of you." Her eyes were bright with emotion. "But we also want to know how you feel about that." Stephen's eyes widened, darting between Daniels and Maria. "You mean, like forever?" His voice trembled slightly. "Yes, sweetheart," Maria smiled warmly. "We want to adopt you, Elijah and Mia. Make you all officially our children, but only if that's what you want too." Daniels nodded encouragingly. "We'll need to go through some legal steps, paperwork, and meetings with social workers. They'll want to talk to you too, to make sure you're happy here." Stephen sat quietly for a moment, processing their words. Then, his face broke into a wide smile, tears gathering in his eyes. "I want that more than anything," he whispered. "You really want us? All of us?" "All of you," Daniels confirmed firmly. "We love you, Stephen, and we love Elijah and Mia too." Unable to contain his emotions any longer, Stephen threw his arms around both of them. "Yes! Yes, please!" he cried, his voice muffled against their embrace. Maria wiped happy tears from her eyes as she held him close. "Then it's settled. We'll start the adoption process right away." Daniels pulled out some papers from his briefcase. "I've already gotten the initial paperwork from Family Services. We can begin filling these out today." As they sat together going through the forms, Stephen's face glowed with joy. For the first time since arriving, he truly felt at home. Maria brought out cookies and milk, making the paperwork feel more like a family activity than a legal procedure. "And once everything's approved," Maria explained, "you'll all have our last name, Daniels. How does that sound?" "Stephen Daniels," the boy tested the name, grinning. "I like it, and Elijah and Mia Daniels too." They spent the next hour completing forms and discussing the next steps in the adoption process. The atmosphere was light and hopeful, filled with the promise of new beginnings. As if on cue, the baby's coos came through the baby monitor, adding their own sweet music to the family moment. Officer Daniels sat at his desk late one evening, the glow of his computer screen illuminating his determined face, while his heart was full with the joy of his growing family at home. His wife and their newly adopted children settling into a beautiful routine, his mind kept returning to the two missing girls from the orphanage. The financial records from Ms. Gravely's accounts lay spread before him, each transaction telling a disturbing story that made his stomach churn. His finger traced a series of payments that led to accounts in neighboring states, his police instincts tingling with each new discovery. The amounts were substantial, far more than any legitimate adoption fees would warrant, some reaching into the tens of thousands of dollars. Working methodically through the night, coffee growing cold beside him, he began to piece together a pattern of transactions that painted a clear picture of a trafficking network. "Got you," he muttered, noting down a recurring account number that appeared multiple times in the suspicious transfers. His hands trembled slightly with anticipation as he reached for his phone and dialed the FBI's trafficking task force. "This is Officer Daniels from Cedar Grove PD," he said firmly, his voice steady despite his racing heart. "I've uncovered a trafficking network connected to the Heartwood orphanage case. I'm sending you the financial records now. These transactions show a clear pattern of illegal activity. Over the next few days, Daniels coordinated with law enforcement agencies across 3 states, barely sleeping as he helped connect the dots. The financial trail led them to a warehouse in Detroit where several children, including the 2 missing girls from Heartwood, were being held behind rusted metal doors. The raid was swift and successful, carried out in the early hours of the morning. Police units stormed the warehouse, arresting 12 members of the trafficking ring who had destroyed so many young lives. In a back room, huddled together but unharmed, they found the 2 girls from Heartwood, along with 5 other children, all wrapped in thin blankets against the cold. Daniels's heart swelled with relief when he received the call confirming their rescue, tears welling in his eyes as he listened to the details. The girls, though shaken and exhausted, were safe and would soon be returning to a very different Heartwood orphanage, one where kindness and care replaced cruelty, and where every child, regardless of their race, would be treated with love and respect. Ms. Rachel Bennett, the new caretaker, had already transformed the orphanage's atmosphere in the weeks since taking over. The dark storeroom had been converted into a bright playroom filled with toys and books, and the children's laughter now filled the halls where fear once lingered. Colorful artwork decorated the walls, and the smell of fresh-baked cookies often wafted through the building. When the 2 girls finally arrived back at Heartwood, they found their old home transformed beyond recognition. Their eyes widened with relief when they learned that Ms. Gravely was gone, replaced by Ms. Bennett's warm smile and gentle demeanor. The nightmare was over and a new chapter was beginning. The story of Officer Daniels' investigation and its impact on the Heartwood orphanage spread quickly through Cedar Grove. What began as whispered conversations at the local diner soon became front-page news in the town's weekly paper. The revelation of Ms. Gravely's crimes and the rescue of the trafficked children touched hearts throughout the community. Mayor Thompson herself proposed the ceremony, and the town council unanimously agreed. They chose the town hall's grand assembly room for the event, decorating it with blue and gold ribbons that caught the afternoon sunlight streaming through tall windows. On the day of the ceremony, the assembly room filled with faces both familiar and new. Teachers from the local school sat beside business owners, while social workers who had helped with the orphanage's transformation chatted with police officers in their dress uniforms. In the front row, Maria sat proudly, holding Elijah and Mia, who were dressed in their Sunday best. Stephen, wearing a crisp new suit, fidgeted nervously beside them. Mayor Thompson approached the podium, her voice carrying across the hushed room. Today, we honor not just an outstanding police officer, but a man whose compassion and determination changed countless lives. Officer Mark Daniels showed us that one person's dedication to doing what's right can transform an entire community. As Daniels walked to the stage, the audience rose in a standing ovation. He stood tall in his dress uniform, though his cheeks flushed slightly at the attention. The mayor presented him with a golden medal, its surface catching the light as she placed it around his neck. When it was Daniel's turn to speak, he surprised everyone by calling Stephen to join him on stage. The boy's eyes widened, but with an encouraging nod from Maria, he made his way forward. "This medal," Daniels said, his voice thick with emotion, "belongs as much to this young man as it does to me. Without Stephen's courage in protecting his siblings and trusting me that day in the alley, none of this would have been possible." He removed the medal from his neck and bent down to place it around Stephen's. "True heroes come in all sizes," he said, loud enough for everyone to hear, "and sometimes the bravest among us are those who protect others even when they're scared themselves." The assembly room erupted in applause as Stephen stood there, one hand touching the medal in disbelief, tears glistening in his eyes. Maria held the babies closer, her own eyes wet with pride and joy, while the crowd rose once again to their feet, celebrating not just Officer Daniels but the remarkable boy who had helped bring justice to Heartwood Orphanage. The years following the ceremony brought profound changes to the Daniels household. Mark and Maria dedicated themselves to creating a nurturing environment where each child could thrive. They transformed their modest home into a sanctuary of learning, filling bookshelves with everything from picture books to encyclopedias. Stephen, the oldest, showed an early interest in medicine after spending time in the pediatric ward where the rescued orphanage children received care. His adoptive parents noticed how he would carefully study the doctor's every move, asking thoughtful questions about treatments and procedures. They encouraged his curiosity, helping him join science clubs and arrange volunteer work at the local hospital during his high school years. Elijah, though younger, found himself drawn to his father's profession. He would sit at the kitchen table, listening intently to Mark's stories about community policing and helping others. During career day at school, he proudly wore a miniature police uniform, telling anyone who would listen about his father's role in saving him and his siblings. Mia developed a sharp sense of justice early on. When she learned about her past at age 12, she channeled her emotions into advocacy, joining the debate team and excelling in social studies. Her parents noticed how she would often defend other students who faced bullying or discrimination, showing the same protective spirit that Stephen had demonstrated years ago. The Daniels parents emphasized education above all else, creating study spaces for each child and spending evenings helping with homework. They attended every parent-teacher conference, science fair, and school event, making sure their children knew they had unwavering support in pursuing their dreams. As the children entered college, their chosen paths reflected both their experiences and the values their parents had instilled. Stephen threw himself into pre-med studies, determined to become a pediatrician who could help vulnerable children. Elijah enrolled in criminal justice courses, preparing for the police academy while maintaining his father's compassionate approach to law enforcement. Mia excelled in pre-law, focusing on cases involving children's rights and family law. Mark and Maria watched with pride as their children pursued their respective careers. They saw how their own actions had created a ripple effect, inspiring each child to choose a path that would help others in meaningful ways. Stephen's gentle manner with patients, Elijah's dedication to community policing, and Mia's passionate advocacy for children's rights all stemmed from the love and guidance they had received in their adoptive home. The family's dining room walls gradually filled with framed achievements: Stephen's medical school acceptance letter, Elijah's police academy graduation photo, and Mia's law school dean's list certificates. Yet more meaningful than these accomplishments were the values behind them, the desire to protect, heal, and fight for justice that Mark and Maria had modeled throughout their children's lives. Dr. Stephen Daniels adjusted his stethoscope as he entered the makeshift clinic he'd set up in the community center. Every Wednesday, he transformed this simple space into a bustling medical facility, serving those who couldn't afford regular healthcare. The walls, once bare, now displayed colorful health education posters, making the environment more welcoming for his young patients. "Good morning, everyone," he called out to the waiting room filled with families. His warm smile, reminiscent of his adoptive father's, put even the most anxious children at ease. A young boy clutching his mother's hand reminded Stephen of himself years ago, scared but brave. Across town, Officer Elijah Daniels patrolled the streets with the same dedication his father had shown. He made it a point to know the names of local shop owners, stopped to chat with elderly residents, and always carried extra snacks for the homeless people he encountered. His badge gleamed in the sunlight, but it was his genuine concern for others that truly made him shine. "Hey there, Mrs. Johnson," he called out to an elderly woman sweeping her porch. "Need any help today?" This simple gesture of kindness, learned from watching his father over the years, helped build the community's trust in law enforcement. Meanwhile, in the courthouse, Mia Daniels stood tall in her crisp suit, presenting her case with passion and precision. Her current case involved protecting a group of foster children from a negligent care facility. Her personal history fueled her determination to ensure no child suffered from systemic abuse or neglect. "Your Honor," she addressed the court, her voice steady and confident, "these children deserve more than just basic shelter. They deserve protection, care, and the chance to thrive." Her words carried the weight of personal experience, making her arguments particularly compelling. Stephen's health camps had become a weekly fixture in various underserved neighborhoods. He took special care with the children from local orphanages, understanding their hesitation and fears. His gentle approach and patient explanations helped break down barriers, making medical care less intimidating for his young patients. Elijah's approach to law enforcement reflected the compassionate policing style he'd witnessed in his youth. He often found himself dealing with troubled teens, and rather than immediately pursuing punitive measures, He worked to understand their circumstances and connect them with appropriate resources. In her legal practice, Mia specialized in cases involving children's rights and family law. Her office walls displayed numerous thank you drawings from young clients, reminiscent of her own childhood artwork that once decorated the Daniels family refrigerator. She approached each case with unwavering determination, ensuring that every child's voice was heard and their rights protected. The siblings' shared commitment to public service stemmed directly from their early experiences. Stephen's medical practice focused particularly on preventive care for underprivileged children. Elijah's police work emphasized community building and protection of the vulnerable. Mia's legal career centered on advocating for those who couldn't speak for themselves. Each of them carried forward the legacy of compassion and justice that Mark and Maria Daniels had instilled in them, transforming their own painful past into a force for positive change in their community. The holiday season brought a special warmth to the Daniels household. Every December, Stephen, Elijah, and Mia made their way home, no matter how busy their schedules were. The familiar scent of Maria's cinnamon cookies filled the air as Mark Daniels watched his grown children file through the door, each carrying gifts and wearing bright smiles. "Dad," Stephen called out, embracing his father with the same enthusiasm he had shown as a child. Elijah and Mia joined in, creating a group hug that brought tears to Maria's eyes as she watched from the kitchen doorway. The living room buzzed with conversation as they shared updates about their lives. Stephen spoke about his latest medical outreach program, while Elijah described a community youth initiative he had started at the police department. Mia excitedly shared news about a landmark case she had won, protecting children's rights in the foster care system. After 35 years of service, Mark Daniels' retirement ceremony was held in the Grand Hall of the police department. The room was packed with colleagues, community members, and family. Photos from his career lined the walls, including the memorable day he had received recognition for uncovering the orphanage scandal. Chief Thompson stood at the podium, his voice carrying across the hushed room. Officer Mark Daniels exemplifies everything a police officer should be: his dedication to justice, his compassion for others, and his unwavering integrity have set a standard for all of us. When Daniels took the stage, he looked out at the faces before him, his fellow officers, his loving wife Maria, and his children, all successful professionals who carried forward his legacy of service and compassion. "Throughout my career," Daniels began, his voice steady and clear, "I've learned that justice isn't just about enforcing laws. It's about seeing the humanity in every person we encounter. It's about standing up for what's right even when it's difficult." He paused, his eyes meeting those of his children in the audience. "Every person deserves to be treated with dignity and respect, regardless of their background or circumstances. The greatest reward of my career hasn't been the commendations or achievements, but the lives we've touched and the families we've helped build." The audience listened intently as Daniels shared his philosophy about equality and justice, values he had not only preached, but lived by throughout his career. His words resonated deeply with everyone present, especially the younger officers who had looked up to him as a mentor. As he concluded his speech, the hall erupted in applause. His family rushed forward to embrace him, their pride evident in their tearful smiles. Maria squeezed his hand, remembering the day he had brought home 3 children who would change their lives forever. If you enjoyed the story of Daniels, I hand-picked this next story that you will enjoy. Please don't miss this one. Click here to watch it.